sleeping. The very idea of falling asleep terrified her. She could not sleep because she knew only too well what awaited her. It was the dream, the horrible recurring dream. In the dream, she always found herself locked in a box. There was no light and it was too narrow to move. The nightmare always ended with the box shattering and then the horrible sensation of falling. Falling, falling, falling. The first time she had this dream, she woke up so terrified that it took well over an hour before she was able to go back to sleep again. The next night, she had the same dream, and the night after that, and the night after that. Every night, the dream returned to haunt her. Sleep and during the day left her trembling with fear of what the next night would bring. She tried to talk to her friends and her parents, but she found no solution to her problems. Finally, she kept it to herself. 2 weeks had passed since the nightmares first started. It was 1 o'clock in the morning, and despite her fear, she finally had to fall asleep. Suddenly, she opened her eyes and found herself surrounded by darkness. Once again, she was standing in the narrow box. She couldn't even raise her arms. She waited motionless like a mummy in its sarcophagus. And then she felt the box shatter on all sides, and the walls of her coffin dropped away, and she felt herself falling. Falling, falling, falling. She tried desperately to clutch onto something, but there was nothing there. She wanted it all to stop. She wanted to discover the secret of this haunting and recurring nightmare. This time, she had to know what happened at the end of the dream, after the fall. She forced herself to stay asleep. She didn't want to wake up. She forced herself to stay in the dream. The silence was absolute. There was no wind, no air, just the awful sensation of falling that terrified her and turned her stomach. She was panicking, but she resisted waking up. She felt increasingly overcome by nausea, dizziness, and fear. She kept her eyes closed and tried to calm down. Then, gradually, the falling sensation vanished, and slowly her body relaxed. She had the impression of being wrapped in cotton. She felt more calm, almost sleepy, as if she was halfway between sleeping and waking. She woke up, lying in her bed. The light was on and her mother was kneeling beside her, tenderly watching over her. Her mother's sweet face was lit by the warm glow of the bedside lamp. She felt safe, calm, and rested. She tried to tell her mother what had happened, but she couldn't move her lips. She tried several times, but they wouldn't budge. Panicked, she tried to move her head, but she couldn't. Then, horrified, she tried to move an arm or a leg, but her body remained still. She was completely frozen. She couldn't even move her eyes. That's where her terror was complete. Her mother began falling to pieces and decomposing in front of her. Her skin turned to dusty parchment and peeled off, revealing the red and oozing flesh beneath. Hundreds of small worms crawled out of her nose and mouth. Her lips gradually broke away and fell off, leaving her jawbone bare. Her eyelids followed and fell off one after the other. She wanted to scream, she wanted to cry, but she couldn't do anything but stare in horror at the spectacle of what was in front of her. Her terror reached new heights as her mother's corpse decomposed into a mushy mass of flesh and bone. She felt her whole body go numb. She was freezing cold. Slowly, she felt herself sinking, 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 until everything turned to darkness and everything disappeared. The next day, her parents found her dead in her bed. She had suffocated during the night. Unbeknownst to her, she was suffering from sleep apnea. Every night while she was asleep, her breathing was slowing down until it finally stopped. The alarm caused by the falling sensation in her nightmares had always woken her and prevented her from succumbing to suffocation. But by forcing herself not to wake up, she finally discovered what lay at the end of the dream. It was death. I loved my wife. You've got to believe me. At least, I did love her when we first got married. As time went on, we grew apart. Love slowly turned to hate, and affection turned to resentment. Every little thing she did began to annoy me, and I grew to detest every minute I was forced to spend with her. Till death do us part. That's what we promised when we read our wedding vows. Little did I know how ironic those wedding vows would turn to be. Hate is a terrible thing. When there's hate in your heart, it festers and grows like cancer. Before you know it, the hate has taken over your mind. It clouds your better judgment. It poisons your thoughts and makes you do things you never thought possible. I hated my wife, and this hatred preyed on my mind. It followed me around like a bad smell and tormented me day after day until I was obsessed with it. Eventually, I got to the point of no return, the point where I was plotting to kill my wife. I wanted to be rid of her, and all I could think of were ways to murder her without getting caught. I came up with an ingenious plan, a plan so cunning, I was sure nothing could go wrong. I told my wife I was taking her on holiday. I pretended that the purpose of the trip was so we could work on our marriage and try to repair what had already been broken. The place I chose for a vacation was a remote hotel high up in the mountains. From the balcony of our hotel room, there was a wonderful panoramic view of the snow-capped mountains that surrounded us. There was also a hiking trail that led all around the mountain and skirted the cliffs. At one point on the trail, there was a spot where the cliff edge was crumbling away. If someone wasn't careful, they could lose their footing and plunge to their death. It was perfect. One glance over the edge was enough to make you dizzy. There was a sheer drop of almost 1,000 feet, and at the bottom there were nothing but jagged rocks that would tear your body to pieces. The next morning after breakfast, I invited my wife to go for a walk with me along the mountain trail. We left the hotel together and hiked up the path, neither of us saying a word. When we reached the spot where the cliff was crumbling away, my wife suddenly stopped in her tracks. She looked over the edge and shuddered. This was my chance to push her off. There was nobody around. We were completely alone. I took a few steps closer to her. My hands were shaking. Then she turned to face me. There was an odd look in her eyes. "Do you have even the tiniest bit of love left in your heart for me?" she asked. There was no reason to lie anymore. "No," I replied. "I thought so," she said. "I just wanted to give you one last chance." "One last chance," I said. "What do you mean?" "Well, before we left the hotel, I wrote a note and gave it to the hotel manager," she said. "I told him that if anything happened to me, he should give it to the police. In the note, I told him, I know you're planning to kill me. I told him that you're planning to push me off a cliff. I know you hate me, but you have no idea how much I hate you. Try as you might, you'll never be able to convince anyone that this was an accident." I was confused. What was an accident? I asked dumbly. Before I had a chance to react, she threw herself off the edge of the cliff. I couldn't get to her in time. I could only watch in horror as she fell, shrieking and whirling, plummeting to her death on the jagged rocks below. She hated me so much that she killed herself just to frame me for a murder I didn't commit. I tried to tell the police that it was an accident, but they didn't believe me. They arrested me and clapped me in handcuffs. During my trial, I testified, telling the jury exactly what happened, but they ignored my story. The note my wife had written was all the evidence they needed. They found me guilty of the murder in the first degree, and the judge sentenced me to death. That's how I came to be sitting on death row. As I languished in this cell, waiting for my execution, I have a lot of time to think. I can't stop myself thinking. I have a lot of regrets, but there's one in particular that torments me. I can't help thinking that getting a divorce would have been so much easier. It was the beginning of summer. School had just finished and people were out enjoying the hot sun. Kids playing in parks and teens going to malls and beaches. A young kid named Marcus was out playing hide-and-go-seek with his friends when a small girl approached him. She asked if she could play with them, and he saw no reason as to why she couldn't. The more the merrier, right? He called out to his friends, saying that someone new wants to join. Once the group had regathered, Marcus started to introduce everyone. "This is Bob, Mary, John, Patricia, Riley, and I'm Marcus," he said as he gestured to each one of the kids. Then to himself, "And you are?" My name is Alice," the young girl said, seemingly having a hard time remembering her name. "All right, Alice, we're gonna do eeny, meeny, miny, mo to choose who gets to be the seeker," Bob said, arranging the group to be a circle. He started chanting as he pointed to different people in the group. "Eeny, meeny, miny, mo, catch a tiger by the toe. If he hollers, let him go. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo." The finger landed on Riley. "Oh, not again," she protested, crossing her arms and slumping off to a nearby tree. 1, 2, 3, 4, she counted, slowly making her way up to 20. As the kids were scrambling around trying to find a hiding place, Alice beckoned for Marcus to follow her as she ran into a nearby forest. "Alice," Marcus called out for her, pausing in front of the forest. "My mom says I can't go in there." "Oh, come on, you big baby," Alice teased as she grabbed onto Marcus's arm, pulling him into the forest. "We're not going in that far." Alice's hand felt cold, almost wet on Marcus's skin. He shivered and followed her into the forest, hiding behind a tree with her. That's when he started to feel something crawling up his arm. He looked down at it, seeing Alice's hand turning into a slimy black mass that had started to cover his arm. He looked up at Alice, only to see her blankly staring back at him. He tried to scream and call for help, but as soon as he opened his mouth, Alice's hand shot up and covered it. Her hand turned into the same slime that covered his arm and started engulfing the rest of his body. As soon as the boy was fully encased in the slime, unable to struggle away, Alice slowly started to deform his body, elongating his neck and limbs, forcing him into a more quadrupled position. The stretching and tearing of flesh, the cracking of bones, and the small, barely audible whimpers could be heard from inside the mass. Marcus felt every minute of it, the excruciating pain of his body being deformed and torn apart. He wanted to cry out, but he couldn't. His senses slowly faded, and the last thing he was able to hear was the cracking of his skull. Alice pulled back, retracting the slime back into her, and smiled, looking up at her newest creation. The late Marcus's body was shaped into a small giraffe, which then fell to the ground, unable to keep itself up. Alice sighed, shrugged, and skipped off, thinking of what animal she could try next. If you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, and share with your friends. If you'd like to, you can follow me at Twitter. The handle is @FuzzyPantaloons, and I'll see you all next time.